Alright, welcome to another lecture for English 1060 Online. Today we're going to do an important aspect called the counter-argument, obviously. And, one argument that was always very funny to me is when people actually signed a petition and there were enough signatures that Obama actually had to acknowledge the deportation of Justin Bieber. Uh, so it was pretty awesome. And so, easily anything could be counter-argued, right? And so determine the reason. So let's look at what it actually is, right? So the counter argument is a rebuttal, right? It's a premise opposed to your thesis or a part of your thesis that expresses the view of the opposition or oppositions, depending on how complex your argument is. In a way, and I see this kind of aspect, most arguers, right, especially like politics is a good example. When people are assholes, they don't include counter arguments because they're assholes, and so it is kind of a counterintuitive aspect. Why would you put something that could undermine your argument? Well, a counter argument gives you the chance to respond to your possible reader's objections, and so very smart people include many counter arguments. And so it also shows that you are a reasonable arguer. And so obviously just turn on Fox News. That's not their purpose, right? Bill O'Reilly is not, on his show to be a reasonable arguer, right? The whole thing is just yelling at people and all this stuff. And so the problem is most people, in very important situations are assholes. And so they don't actually set up a counter argument. When we get to this area where we're supposed to be as civil and objective and smart and reasonable as possible, logical thinkers will consider arguments, and they'll consider not just one. People always use that cliche like both sides of the coin, right, or both sides of the story. Well, no, any kind of argument has numerous sides. Abortion would be a good example where it's not just pro versus con. There's all sorts of middle grounds. There's all sorts of gray areas, morally speaking, religiously speaking, all sorts of things, right? And so logical thinkers will consider the numerous sides of the debate. And the counter argument, again, just shows that you are a logical, critical thinker, right? So here's what's going on. In research-driven, persuasive, argumentative writing, counter-arguments are used to show your readers that you are knowledgeable about a full range of positions other than your own. It's to make you actually sound even smarter. As a rhetorical strategy, it demonstrates that you are interested in finding common ground and consensus with your opponents, right? You're not just trying to destroy them, and you're not just trying to convert them. As a statement of your character, it shows that you are honest, forthcoming, right, about your viewpoints. That might jeopardize your position, and this is what key, because this is what makes a very intelligent person, again, an intelligent person, is when you start actually thinking about the counter arguments. If you realize that your argument is weakening because you're putting counter arguments in, well, guess what? You're supposed to change your mind. A good argument will consider counter arguments and still be that much stronger. And so if you're ever in a moment, right, where you're discussing counter arguments and you're realizing, oh wow, my argument doesn't sound as strong anymore, time to get a new argument. And so this is what's very important about this stage of argumentation, right? The mature academic stage of argumentation. In terms of the formula, there's 3 stages of producing a counter argument. So you acknowledge the other side, right? Which makes sense, right? You provide a paraphrase with useful examples of an argument, posed by your potential or actual opponents, because this is what key is, right? Sometimes, especially if you're doing a very controversial idea, you may already have people talking about this idea, and in numerous ways, right? And so you may already have your actual opponents. Other times, you are doing this to anticipate your opponents. And so in either way, you want to anticipate, right, or acknowledge that people disagree. This proof shows your readers that you are not only, that you not only understand the complex ideas of your opponents, but can explain them clearly and without bias. And that's a very important aspect. If you could acknowledge your opponent's viewpoints, in a very objective, logical way, it shows you that you're that much better of a person, right? Again, you should, of course, always remain neutral. Don't insult, for example. And again, this is very tough because we are trained, especially day-to-day basis, we constantly see arguments that quickly devolve into name calling or so forth, right? Even just recently, a couple Fox News correspondents called the Democrats jerks. It's just like, really? Yeah, like, it's just, that's not helpful, right? In a very logical academic way, you shouldn't be doing that, right? And so, this is the problem and again, the other side does it too, right? Janine Garofalo would be a good example. Al Franken would be a good example of just, the liberal type of argument that just is kind of sarcastic and constantly belittling the other side, right? So that's not very helpful. We don't really see a lot of times helpful uses of counter arguments because people are just worried about ratings. And so once you acknowledge the aspect, right, you have another form of acknowledgement, and this is stage 2, right? You provide a statement conceding to the merit of some part of the opposing argument. So you acknowledge that it exists. You actually then provide a statement that concedes that, yes, they have some merit, right? Or some part of the opposing argument, either in the argument itself or in the character and values of the arguer, that, this person or this idea holds water, right? So doing so establishes common ground, right? And shows that you are representing the opposition as fairly as possible. Right? So you point out the logic, the values, interpretations, motivations, right, that you respect in the opposing argument, right, which shows you are capable of empathy and understanding. So you acknowledge that they exist, right? You give credence, to the merit of their argumentation. And then, of course, right, then you knock it down, right? Then, this is where you refute, right? You rebut. And so in the refutation stage, right, you argue, of course, against the opponent, right, on terms introduced by in your acknowledgement. Yes, actually. So what you do, of course, is subvert the choice of criteria the opposing view uses by introducing what you believe to be a more valid set of criteria to discuss the argument, right? So you remain, of course, even-tempered, right? You use a rational tone. You don't just be like, the guy's a poo-poo head kind of thing, right? You address those parts of the opposing argument with which you cannot agree. So what you could focus on is maybe they're interpreting the facts incorrectly. Maybe they're just using illogical examples, or not enough examples, or not considering other examples. Or you could kind of look at and evaluate the way they're misrepresenting the issue. Or you could, again, talk about overlooked ideas. Well, yes, this is correct. However, they haven't considered blank, 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 right? And so these kind of 4 important ways to refute, right, are key in terms of, again, preserving a logical way of essentially undermining another person's argument. And so instead of doing it in a very harsh and immature way, you look at specific criterion points, again, interpretation of facts, illogical examples, misrepresentations, or overlooked ideas, in order to, again, make yourself just look that much better. So you understand the other person's argument, you understand that their argument has validity in certain ways, but they're missing crucial aspects, either with their facts, examples, representations, or ideas. And so at this stage now, again, your argument then becomes that much stronger. So with disagreement, and this is from Paul Graham, there's a really interesting hierarchy of disagreement. So obviously a lot of times what we see are just kind of the first 2 disagreements. So it would be name calling, right? Just calling out the person, right? Name calling, insulting. The other is ad hominem, which is a logical fallacy, right? It attacks the characteristics or authority of the writer without addressing, again, the argument itself. So it's the same thing what I just gave you. If you're just going to call Democrats jerks, well, that's not really helping, right? So that's not only name calling, but you're just kind of, insulting their character without actually, responding to their arguments. The next level of disagreement is responding to their tone. So you criticize the tone of writing, right, without criticizing the substance. Well, that just sounds weird, or that doesn't sound right, and so you respond to the tone. The next stage is contradiction, right? Here's where you kind of, you just state the opposing case with little or no supporting evidence. At the counterargument stage, this is when you contradict, and you back up that contradiction with reason, supporting evidence, right? And then, of course, the next stage would be refutation. So you find errors, explain why there is a mistake. Again, you use concrete evidence. And then the refuting the central point. So you explicitly refute the central point, not the person who's making the argument, which is what's happening with the first two, lower levels. And so again, this is an interesting kind of working guide. I almost think that counter argument, refutation, and refuting central point kind of could be the same thing, but this is an often referenced triangle to just kind of look at how we respond to other people, right, in a very immature and mature way depending on who we are. And so I like this hierarchy, so definitely kind of think about this as kind of a nice little model to think about how we disagree with people. So again, just to kind of conclude, right, counter arguments can go anywhere pretty much except the conclusion, because that would just make no sense. Sometimes, depending on your argument and how you structure your essay, sometimes the introduction is a good place to kind of discuss, okay, so here's what all the critics are saying, right? Here's what I'm going to say, kind of thing, right? So you could kind of add to their ideas. You could do it, in the supporting paragraphs, which that makes sense just from a logical standpoint. You make your thesis statement, you provide good examples, and then you consider the counter argument. Then you provide better examples and go from there. Right? So again, offering counter arguments are an important aspect to research-driven arguments because it raises your ethos, right? It raises your power as a writer. Again, it shows that you understand all the complex aspects and subtopics to your overall issue. And as always, if you can't think of any good counter argument, just criticize their spelling and grammar. That's the easiest way to kind of undermine another writer, right? And so, again, this is just kind of a good rhetorical tool to just consider, because oftentimes people bypass any kind of counter argument. And so, especially in essay 4, the counter argument is going to be very crucial to kind of make sure you really understand all sorts of issues and subtopics and ideas related to your overall argument. Obviously, if you have any questions, always email. If not, enjoy the rest of the week, and we'll just kind of work on a lot of counter-argument issues during this week.